as Sabrina mentioned, I started a nonprofit called Earthard. We've been based out of Brooklyn since 2017, though we're trying to expand upstate, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But today we're going to talk about mycology in the Anthropocene, right? You guys are Columbia folks, so we're understanding that like Anthropocene referring to the geological period of time that we've probably been in since like maybe right before the Industrial Revolution, but there's still like some hesitance to really name it the Anthropocene and really like move full force into like accepting that we are actually like affecting the planet on a geological, global environmental scale. But I think it's a really important conversation to have, especially with all the conflict that's happening in the world right now. Like, to really look at alternative systems and models for like modeling human social hierarchies, for modeling our resource management, for modeling how we move through the world, and like what is like one of the best teachers in this way, not only plants, but also especially mushrooms that like make life on Earth, A, possible, but B, they also offer a lot of alternative ways of looking at resources, looking at waste. Is it waste or is it a resource? Looking at ways of dealing with pollution, especially too. So we'll talk about all the applications, but just for reference, so we'll talk a little bit about Earthard, what I do, why I'm here. We'll talk a little bit about some of the references and the folks that I look up to if you're interested in learning more about mycology or have an interest in pursuing like your own mycological explorations, like who you can look into. We'll talk a little bit about phylogeny and how it fits into mycology in terms of just like the evolutionary development of these species and like how it fits into like the whole evolution of like all life on Earth. Then we'll talk a little bit just about like mycelium running in terms of like understanding the biology of mushrooms in the simplest way that we can try. And then from there, like after understanding their biological functions and understanding their roles on Earth naturally, like how we can apply those roles for a more sustainable future. So again, I mentioned Earthard. We used to have a space. It was where we held all our workshops, all of our events. We had, this was a mushroom, a mycology talk. This was like a poetry workshop. We had a lot of like healing fairs, like wellness initiatives, trying to bring people together, open mics, and this was a land-based sovereignty discourse with 596 acres, which doesn't actually exist anymore, but this was like a conversation on like land access. So our focus has really been about like bridging the like environmental science community with just like the public. So as Sabrina mentioned, I did undergrad environmental. It's so confusing because my undergrad was environmental policy and science, but my master's was ESP, and I always like mix them up. That's environmental science and policy, and that was at SEPA. MPA, ESP, SEPA. Yeah, it's just like a long acronym. But especially if you guys have been in those environments, like it's very hard to have these conversations every single day for like hours and hours and hours about all the ways that like humans are destroying the planet, and then like not really A, having like access to really valid solutions, and then B, not having a way to communicate those solutions to people on a scale that A, like is interesting to them, because usually people just get really depressed when you talk about climate change or environmental issues and they kind of shut it down, but B, also like to try and create it in a inviting and engaging way. So like getting people not only excited about environmentalism, but understanding that like their personal choices have a much greater impact, and like the collective choices we make as a society, like leading to like better overall options, like, right? So like the pressures of communities being able to actually change the options that we're being presented with. So we had this space. After our second year of being in that space, we actually started working with this youth group, and they started using the space a little bit more. They're called Educate Little Monsters, and that freed me up because I was only doing like 1 or 2 events a month at that space to do more on-site gardening and nature education at different schools around the city. So these were some of my 5-year-old students that I had up in Inwood, and we're doing like seed collecting, seed saving. These are my middle school students. We had a garden, and like a lot of my work has really been about like trying to like bridge bridge this like debate of like, why is environmental science this thing that you have to like go to school for to understand? Why isn't it like a human right? Why don't we have just a right to understand like the world around us? So if that's like, if you're interested in like learning more about what we do, or like I'll talk a little bit more about some of the initiatives we're working on towards the end. But if you're interested, everything's on earthardcenter.com, everything's on Instagram, and you can look it up. But from there, like, I would just segue right into like my love of mushrooms. Mushrooms really brought me in terms of like my understanding of ecology, like to just like a deeper like appreciation of like something. I mean, I'm sure like a few of you obviously are like in the environmental science program. So it's these things that we refer to in like the academic circles as like ecosystem services, and trying to like name these natural biological functions that like sustain all life on Earth, and name them as like these free services, and like trying to see them as these like privileges that that we all as humans have access to on the planet. And like mushrooms do so much for us. Like I think it's really funny, like we consider these services like this like free right, but really they're luxuries, right? Because if we disturb these systems enough, we can really shoot ourselves in the foot, and we're already seeing some of the effects of that. So I read Anna Singh's The Mushroom at the End of the World. She actually came to speak at Barnard when I was like a junior, sophomore, and she super inspired me. So if you're interested in just like having, you know, a little bit more of like a in-depth, detailed examination of like the very complex, interwoven like relationships between mushrooms and economies and like ecologies, this is a really awesome book that weaves basically the Japanese like market for this like delicacy mushroom, and it weaves it into like how wood is produced in Oregon. Like she basically is able to illustrate how like the mushroom is this like perfect model for not just interconnectivity and the networks of like human societies, but also like trying to model out that like mushrooms hold cultural significance, they hold health significance, they hold like nutritional value. They're really easy to grow, especially if we were talking about post-apocalyptic narratives, which I super hate to bring up, but like mushrooms will grow on anything. I literally saw a reishi, like a giant reishi, like bigger than my face, like growing on a pair of jeans, right? So if we're talking about like we're living in an increasingly toxic world, an increasingly like polluted world, like what is an option for remediating? And mushrooms time and time again come up. So this lecture and a lot of like discourses I have around mycology, and especially like mycology's practical applications, are a lot of them are referenced from this book. And then also just in terms of like other mushroom heroes, like if you're just getting interested in mycology, I mean, humans have had a fascination with mushrooms for forever. This is an image from 5000 BC in the Sahara Desert, like representing a mushroom figure. Richard Evanschulte, he's considered the father of modern ethnobotany. Him and his wife basically went to South America and began the first documentations of so many different plants, not only like hallucinogenic plants, but they were really in this mode of like documenting plants, not just for their like practical commercial uses, right, which like people have been doing since forever, but also trying to see like the actual human plant relationships, like really keying in on human plant relationships and trying to understand like the complexities of those. So if you're interested in looking deeper into like ethnobotany and like understanding the like cultural relationships that like different people around the world have with plants, especially mushrooms, he has a lot of writing. Another person who's like the mushroom guy in the mushroom world right now, Paul Stamets, he created a brand called Fungi Perfecti. He basically, these are two links, so I can also send Sabrina the links to the actual slides. But you can watch, he has a TED talk on turkey tail, and it's like anti-cancer benefits, and his mom was basically like given a death sentence and is still alive today. And like turkey tail, in addition to chemo, was like her mode of treating that. And then he also talks about a lot of the things that we'll be talking about, like mushrooms for remediation, mushrooms for food, mushrooms for textiles, and like really seeing mushrooms as outside of just being this like poisonous thing. Most people have this like idea that like mushrooms are just really poisonous and you should avoid them, right? Moving outside of that like typical narrative and really trying to see mushrooms as like allies and companion species. He has a bunch of really awesome books: Mycelium Running, Growing Gourmet Medicinal Mushrooms, The Mushroom Cultivator, and Mycomedicinals. So check out anything by him. And like he's also a testament that like you don't have to be like a classically trained mycologist. Like there's barely even like the field itself is still really like in its like fetal stages. It's still like developing. Like when Paul Stamets went to college, there wasn't even like a mycology major. Like he had to make it for himself. So I think, you know, like if you're like hesitant for any reason, you know, don't be, just start reading. And then these are some other folks who really inspired me: Michael Pollan, Terrence McKenna, and then Craig is actually in New York. Craig runs a program called NYC.MYC, and he's also the compost coordinator at Harlem Grown. And he's just like one of the people who's like doing research on like mushroom genetics for like eating cigarette butts, and like trying to figure out how you can quantify like mycelial soil connectivity and like soil productivity back to like higher yields, and like trying to like put numbers on that so people can see like, oh, organic farming actually does make more food if you do it on the right scale and you do it properly. So these are people who, you know, like investigate them more. And then we'll jump straight from that into phylogeny and trying to understand like the place of mushrooms in the bigger biological like evolutionary tree and evolutionary relationships, right? So we have our archaea, we have our bacteria, we have our protists, right? And then we have this like, it's almost like a hand. It's like plants, mushrooms, animals. And it's like this right here, this middle land here is very confusing for people. Like we're still working out the details of exactly like who came from who and how. People will say that like, and like, oh yeah, fungi either like they either branched off from animals, or did animals branch off from fungi, right? So we're having this discourse of like trying to actually look at these evolutionary relationships. The real like unfortunate truth is that these relationships are extremely complicated, and there are people who go to school for their whole lives just to study taxonomy and phylogeny, and they still don't know, right? So here is a chart of trying to either map out relationships that are hypothetical, relationships that are supported by taxonomy, and then relationships that are trying to map out non-monophyletic taxa. So like this is like, there's assumptions about how things should be, but then at the end of the day, it's like we can't actually get to the finer details, and people are still working it out. And there's a lot of debates, and it makes it very frustrating if you're trying to, like, for example, make a presentation, because you'll find some illustrations that will maybe have like certain parts of the diagrams like flipped, right? So like, I don't even have to get into that too much more deeply, except for that, like, we're, for the sake of brevity and like making it through this presentation with enough time to also take questions, that like we're gonna keep it like short and sweet in terms of like the actual phylogenetic relationships, and just so that we can manage it, right? So if we're looking at like the actual like evolution of all life on Earth, right? Mushrooms are pretty early, and they are basically, I mean, they're one of the first like breaks from these very simple organisms that are not technically plants, they're not technically like algae or sponges, they're somewhere in the middle. So they do share a common ancestor, but like the details of how who came first, or like how that evolved, is like it's still being researched all the time. And like even within the clades of mushrooms, it's so complicated, right? Like this is like one of the simplest diagrams I could try to find, and it's still like extremely complicated in terms of mapping out the evolutionary relationships. And you can also see like you'll have these schisms, and then you'll have clades, and then within the clades, like you'll have like orders. So these are like things, if you're interested in phylogeny or botany, or mycology, obviously, like this is where like if you're learning to identify mushrooms, like this is how this can actually be helpful. It looks totally overwhelming and it's like, why would you, how is this helping? But if you're like out in the woods and you're really trying to identify something, understanding its family, being like, oh, it's a polypore, okay, it's probably not poisonous, versus something over on this side, these are like the more ancient mushrooms. They're like sometimes really slimy, or they'll be like full of weird goos, and they're kind of not totally like formed like as obviously as the mushrooms maybe as that we're used to seeing. Those are the ones that you probably want to avoid, to be totally honest. A lot of the mushrooms that are edible and delicious, that you can find when you're out foraging, they kind of look edible and delicious. Like they don't look like dark and like stinky and stuff. But so that's where like phylogeny, in terms of the practical applications of phylogeny that you can use day to day, trying to understand the biological relationships between the mushrooms. So when you're out in the woods, you can be like, okay, I know for a fact that this is a polypore, and like there are almost no poisonous polypores. I'm okay. Like even if it's not the exact mushroom I'm looking for, it's not going to kill me. So this is where like we can start using phylogeny, and then also trying to understand in terms of like what mushrooms are good for what, right? So this is a super simplified version of that schema. The mushrooms we're so used to seeing really are like Basidio, Mycota. They're like your typical kind of like toadstool mushrooms. We got morels here in Mycota, and then you get like your more like molds and slime molds and smuts, sometimes they're also called in this whole area, and they're also different in their reproductive style. So this is like in terms of their evolution, like you can see the changes. So and in terms of like the debate, right, there's still debates, for example, over these prototaxites. So people will say that like these ancient organisms were like 24 feet high, and that these were some of the first mushrooms. So if you think of like this is someone who's unearthing the fossil of what they think are these giant mushrooms, there's still a lot of debate. And this is what I'm like trying to hammer home, is like we can figure out in terms of like if you know something is a bolete, or if you know something is like a death cap angel mushroom, like that is very clear. But in terms of understanding the true origins of mushrooms and like how that relates to the bigger picture, it's still an evolution. So just for our sake, and because we're short on time, the way you can think about it basically, and especially in the evolutionary like time scale and like the timeline, is like we got our molds, mildews, rusts and smuts, yeasts, and mushrooms, right? And mushrooms being true mushrooms. Like this is the whole kingdom fungi. So this actually that we're looking at is called a smut. It's a fungi, right? But it's not like our typical mushroom that we're thinking of. It's more like it's this like mass. It doesn't have like the typical structure where it makes spores. Like, so this is a corn smut. Some people will consider it a parasite. Other people will consider it a mutualism. In Mexico, this is actually a delicacy. People will make like all different foods with it, and it's actually considered something that like you can work with. It's not like a pest, versus like our very like Western approach to like agriculture, where we have to spray the heck out of everything because like God forbid you get some like huitlacoche like growing on your corn. And so like this is also another example of how like our how people before us have also like cultivated these relationships with mushrooms, and actually can see like the benefits of them outside of them just being a nuisance. And then you can go from that series of categorizations of like molds, mildews, rusts, and smuts, yeast, and mushrooms. And inside of that, there are saprophytes, or decomposers. These are mushrooms that eat dead things, right? Their role in the world is to take raw material that's out in the woods that's like dead, fallen, and decay it and recycle those nutrients back into the earth. So plants are very effective at getting sugar and draining out water and like getting sunlight, but they're not so good at getting like the hard, like the minerals that are in the rocks around them and breaking those rocks down, right? Mushrooms can literally grow through rocks, they can grow through trees, they can grow through just about anything, and they're able to break down those harder materials and unlock the nutrition that's in the environment. And they actually can have mutualistic symbiotic relationships with plants where they're making a trade, right? I'll trade you like all these minerals if you can give me sugar, because the mushroom likes sugar. So this is where like these mutualistic relationships for mushrooms, not just like like what we saw with the smut, but like in the bigger like scheme of like when you go into a forest and you lift up all that leaf litter and you see all those little white hairs, that is mushrooms actively, that is the primordial phase of the mushroom. That's before it reaches its fruiting body phase, which is its sexual phase. The mycelial phase is really like, is it kind of, I don't want to say it's like a baby, but it's like the mushroom in its growing phase still. It's like we'll get into like more of the biology of it in a second anyway. But this is what I just want to bring up, is like you can actually go from all those categorizations of like what kinds of fungi there are, and then further categorize them into like, this is a decomposer, this is a mutual symbiosis, or a parasite. So I don't know if any of you have heard, for example, about Cordyceps. Cordyceps is a very special kind of fungi that likes to like hijack bugs, and it can make the bugs like move around, and it can create basically a whole new neural system inside of the insect, and just like, it's really scary. It like can use the insect as like a puppet and like move the insect around for its own sake. Like it wants to go and colonize the whole rest of the population. So I've seen like, you can find, there's lots of videos of like Cordyceps inoculating like a ant hill, where it's like one ant gets infected and then its like body gets hijacked, and then it goes to the highest point above the colony and it releases the spores of the Cordyceps, so like the whole colony gets like Cordyceps infection. On the one hand, super scary, very alien, like I don't know, like, you know, I don't know if I can like, it's nature, I don't know what else I can say about that. But on the other hand, people have found that there's a lot of health benefits to Cordyceps, especially in terms of like rebuilding neurophysical systems, like especially our nervous systems, people who deal with Lyme. It can be really helpful for like connective tissue. So there's a lot of overlap in like the genetics that we're still uncovering. And then going back to like mutual symbiotes. So this is a chaga. It might look like a total like tumor on this birch tree, but actually what the chaga is doing is like, it's like there's a nick or a scratch or like a bump in the tree, and the chaga finds its way in, and it colonizes, and it actually closes the wound of that tree, but it's not killing the tree. Like you will only find chaga on like living birch trees. So this is where you can see that like mushrooms don't just exist in the world like just to decompose things. They also actually are providing active ecosystem services, right? Like all around us all the time. So in terms of like getting a little bit more into just trying to understand the classifications, this is talking about mushrooms, like mushrooms proper, right? Macroscopic ones you don't need to like look with like a microscope, right? Because it's like we're not really talking about like molds and spore or like yeasts and things like that. So you got your truffles, right? They're kind of on their own. They're kind of on their own scale. And then above ground fungi, you have basidiomycetes, and then like cup and flask fungi, especially like morels. They have these very strange structures. They're not so like what we're used to seeing. And then from basidiomycetes, you got your jelly fungi, your polypores, and your crusts. So have you ever seen like a wood ear and it just looks like this weird goopy thing, or like it's often used in like Asian cuisines, it's like very gooey kind of mushrooms. You also have coral fungi, club fungi, and then at the end of basidiomycetes, you have like our true toadstool mushrooms, and you have mushrooms that have gills, and then you have mushrooms that have tubes, and those are like slightly different like reproductive structures, but they still make basidium. So we'll talk a little bit about what a basidium is. So when you think about the life cycle of the mushroom, we often think of the mushroom itself, right? Which is really funny because it is both the end and the beginning of the life cycle. So the mushroom is the fruiting body. That's the part that we're used to seeing. In each of these gills is this amount, like this huge, just like, it's like they're all packed in together of basidia. One single mushroom can make an uncountable number of spores. Like you couldn't even like think about, like if you think on the scale of how microscopic each spore actually is from one single mushroom, it's almost like immeasurable, like how much one single mushroom can reproduce itself. Paul Stamets has a really interesting diagram where it's like if you have a little piece of mycelium, you can make that one little piece of mycelium go from 1 jar to 1,000 jars in just a couple of months, right? You're gonna have weird genetics because you're basically like inbreeding your mushrooms, right? But at the end of the day, this like going back to like how can we use mushrooms for sustainability? How can we use mushrooms as a model for the future? Like you can't kill mushrooms in a way that matters. Like you just can't. There's just no way, right? Because every time, even if I cut a little piece of this mushroom off, like even if I just cut a little piece of it off and I threw it like out in the woods, that little piece has the potential to germinate and like repopulate itself. Like you could go in the forest and just like kick a bunch of mushrooms to smithereens because you're pissed, and like you're probably just propagating them actually, like on a farther scale. So the basidium are these little structures, and then they have the spores on the end. They release the spores out, and then the spores germinate. They find each other, right? If they have genetically compatible. The genetics of mushrooms is very complicated. I am not an expert. That's something you could ask Craig about, but he has a lot of like research that talks about how mushrooms have like, you potentially could theorize that mushrooms have multiple genders, like not just like because they're basically asexually producing, but if you look at the actual like zygotes that they're producing, like the actual like variation that's within each zygote, like it's like a genderless being in a lot of ways, but in a lot of other ways, the actual like genetic material that each zygote is like carrying can vary so much that like one single mushroom can have like a huge profile, like an extreme genetic variation even within one species. So that's why also studying mushrooms can be very complicated. Anyway, so you have your spores, they germinate, they fuse together, and they create this network called hyphae. The hyphae is when you are looking in the forest and you see those like little hairs of mycelium. So that's the baby mushroom basically going out into the world and looking for nutrition and slowly digesting the world around it. Mushrooms, you can also think of them, especially in this phase, as like they're just stomachs. Like they are basically just like mouths and stomachs that move in the world and are able to digest whatever's around them. And once they have a strong enough colony of hyphae or mycelium, like a strong enough mat, and there's nothing else to eat, they'll begin their fruiting process, right? Because the resources are running low. Okay, it's time to repopulate. So you get this like amalgamation of all the hyphae together. You get the beginning of something called a pinhead or a primordia. That's a baby, itty bitty baby mushroom. And then from the primordia, you get a fruiting body, and the fruiting body makes spores, and the whole thing starts over again, right? So this is like an example of mycelium. You might have some mycelium that never goes to fruit. It just never goes to fruit because it's just colonizing the whole forest floor. There could be different networks of mycelium that are coexisting together. As a mushroom like scientist in my own like experiments, like you can keep mycelium in a suspended state for a very long time. Like mushrooms in cold, like vacuum spaces will pretty much last forever. So you might never even get a mushroom if you have, just working from mycelium, or like the conditions might not be good enough, right? Like the conditions might not actually warrant a true mushroom, like a fruiting body, to be grown. So that's what the mycelium looks like. We're talking here is pinheads and primordia, right? So the mushroom's like, okay, we found a good spot, time to reproduce, time to colonize. So they create these like small, like they create these networks. You see here, like this is a pinhead or a primordia right here, is where these masses of hyphae mat together, and they just fuse together to create the beginning of a new mushroom. And then from there, you see this fully colonized. There's nothing left, right? It's completely this mycelial mat. The mushroom's like, okay, we got to go to the next place. Time to sporulate. And this is also just, you know, just for extra, if you're like super nerdy. Right here, you can see this mushroom is ready to be picked. These mushrooms are just about ready to be picked because the gills are not quite revealed yet. There's a spore, there's a veil. There's a veil that hides the spore. So when the mushroom is growing out, you can see here, there's no veil, there's no anything, there's no tear. But when the mushroom is really ready to release spores and it's ready to like begin its end of its life cycle, the veil will tear down at the bottom of the mushroom, opening up the space for the gills to release their spores, right? So this is like the full cycle of the mushroom, right? And here's all the different kinds of Basidia. I'm sorry I couldn't find like a better quality image, but this is just to illustrate to you that there's like so many thousands of species. Like I couldn't even in like 10 days like really like get through all of the material that we really could spend, like all the time we could really spend on mushrooms. But I just want to give you guys an idea of like when you're around the world, that's what's going on. And so now we can go from there to like actual applications for the future, right? So we have our practical applications that we're all used to seeing, like this is cheese or beer or bread or just, you know, when you have mold in the kitchen. But in terms of like actually using mushrooms for the future, one particular application that I'm super obsessed with is sustainable food sources. So you can grow mushrooms on almost any substrate, as I mentioned before. Oyster mushrooms in particular will grow on coffee grounds. So these are pink oysters. People make a lot of coffee grounds. That's a lot of food waste that's going into our trash systems, our garbage systems, our landfill systems. Those are anaerobically decomposing, right? All that food waste is anaerobically decomposing and contributing to methane. And like methane is a way worse greenhouse gas. I don't understand why people don't talk about methane more. So this is like a visual of like how you can set up like a huge mushroom grow and actually be able to feed a lot of people. My only issue with a lot of these commercial mushroom grows is that they have these plastic bags. The bags have to be pasteurizable. They have to reach a really high heat without melting. So if any of you guys want to create like a hemp corn hybrid mushroom bag that eventually decomposes, there's a huge market for that. I think it's going to happen. But these are just some more examples, right? So you can see the little primordia like kind of sticking out. They're getting ready to fruit. And I want to also emphasize mushrooms are not photosynthetic. They're photosensitive. So much of the work that's going on, like the mycelium growing and spreading, that happens usually under the soil. And once the mycelium hits the surface of the soil and it hits some light, that triggers the fruiting process. So here's just some more images of these. These are super DIY. Like you can just literally do this at home with some hay. You can do it with some barley, millet, whatever you have, you can grow oyster mushrooms on. Like it's super duper simple. And then also just foraging them out in the wild. You can also grow them, like farm them out. If you have land, you can inoculate your logs and stack them, water them regularly. It takes a really long time. It's like about a year versus like a couple of weeks, but it's a more sustainable way of growing mushrooms. And then you can also reuse the wood later, like whether you're building beds or like doing hugelkultur or trying to do like alternative composting methods. Mushrooms are your friend, right? And also they're delicious. And if you are trying to like find meat alternatives, mushrooms are like one of the best ones, right? Like it basically tastes like flesh, but it's like a plant flesh. It's strange. Outside of that, I'm going to just zoom through these because I really want to focus on the end. I can't believe we only have 10 more minutes. Mushrooms for sustainable medicine. So this is a reishi, organoderma. Reishi is considered like the queen of mushrooms in Chinese medicine. It has so many different species and varieties. It's very good for immune modulation, for especially if you're dealing with like allergies or like autoimmune stuff. We also have chaga, like I mentioned before. Chaga is like revered in Siberia. It's basically like it's basically almost extinct in Siberia because people have been harvesting it for so long. We also, so this is what you might see in nature when you look at it. No one has also been able to cultivate chaga before. So if there's anyone who's like, I'm gonna do it, please figure it out, because we're, as a society, really like over harvesting chaga. And this also goes back into the ethics of like, how much can we take without it affecting like the larger ecosystem? Like, are we affecting the genetics by over harvesting? Like, these are important questions, right? So chaga is another really good one for immune system. One that you can eat that's also really good for you is Maitaki, or Hen of the Woods. This one grows in our region. All of them grow in our region. Like, if you went out on a good day after the rain in June, you might find any of these, honestly. So you got Maitaki, Hen of the Woods. You got Chicken of the Woods. This particular specimen's a little bit beat up. So if I were you, I would not harvest like any of this stuff. These obviously like someone else got to it before you and is like nomming at it a little bit. That's where like maybe, you know, you want to let it be. You want to find, when you find mushrooms you want to eat for you, you want them to be like beautiful, pristine, like no slimy, no sludge, like no bugs crawling around in it. Like, and at the end of the day, like if you find it and you're like, you know, disparaging that like you can't eat it and you can't harvest it, like remember that like the earth is not just for you. There are other beings that can benefit from it, and just leave it alone. And especially when it's at this phase, because it'll be at a phase of like wanting to reproduce itself. So if you're a true scientist, why don't you just take a little piece of it and put it in some agar and like grow a culture at home and then grow your own, like that. That's another option if you see it at this point of decomposition, basically. Another favorite is lion's mane. This is really good for neurocognitive function, for people with like Alzheimer's. It's being tested. It's also really, really delicious, and you can make like soups or stir fry it or patties and stuff with it. And basically, if you have mushrooms at home, you want to decoct them. They're very hard to eat raw. It's very rare for humans to eat raw mushrooms. It's not a common phenomena, particularly because a lot of mushrooms have this cell wall chemical called chitin, which is not super easy to digest for humans. So you want to decoct it, which means you boil it on low for at least like 1 or 2 hours. So if you have chaga, if you have reishi, if you have any of the other mushrooms I mentioned, just make sure to boil them for a while. And then you can also tincture them, which means making an alcohol extract. I just want to super duper quickly emphasize that mushrooms are like 99.9% water, and they don't have as many of the terpenes and alkaloids that tend to be alcohol soluble chemicals that are more commonly found in like plants or like resinous herbs. So people will often do something called a double extract, which means you do like a alcohol extract first, and then you use that same plant material after you've siphoned out like the actual mushroom material and the alcohol out, that you do a second extract with water, and then you recombine the two. And then obviously mushroom broths, and it's like just any seasonal vegetables, any mushrooms that you have. If you're vegetarian, that's plenty. If you're not, you can add bones into that mix. And I think of that as like a super, like the best food for the end of the world, right? It's like bones and mushrooms, and making like broth from that that's really nutritious. And also like thinking about like using the nutrition that's around us to the fullest extent. Like bones have the most minerals, collagen, and most bioavailable minerals for us, and like that tends to be like what we throw away in industrial agriculture at like obscene levels, or it all goes to get incinerated to make like tattoo ink out of. So eat your bones and mushrooms together in broth is like a perfect mix, and just put it in a slow cooker or put it on the stove for 6 to 8 hours on super low. So that's in terms of like the food and medicine component. And now in terms of like actually using mushrooms for like the future, in terms of like breaking down dead and decaying materials and redistributing bionutrients back to the ecosystem, and using this quality outside of organic material. So I said saprophytes earlier. Another term is also heterotrophs. So this means like all the beings that like love to eat dead things, right? Like there are decomposers, there are upcyclers. So the terms I like to use is like mushrooms for remediation. So we can help improve compost production and just double our compost production by integrating mushrooms and mycelium. We can also use these like saprophytic or heterotrophic functions for decomposing plastics or cigarette butts or any number of like waste that we've come up with. And they've even found that mushrooms are capable of remediating radiation, especially in Chernobyl. So we're gonna like start unpacking all of that. So for example, this is bokashi. This is a traditional Korean method of farming where they ferment grains and then they use the fermented grains to expedite the composting process. So it's like literally farming fungi, farming yeast to help expedite your compost process, and then also unlock more minerals and nutrients from your compost faster so that you can reintegrate it into your soil faster. So that's bokashi. That's a traditional Korean method of farming. I'm really interested in biodynamics, which was created by Rudolf Steiner. It's a system of agriculture that's like very astrological and very esoteric, but it's also like super practical. Like the place I study is over 100 years old. It's called the Pfeiffer Center. If any of you guys are in New York, they're doing a huge plant sale Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. It is like the perfect model for the future, I feel like, because they have like a school, a Waldorf school, they have a Waldorf Teachers College, they have a food co-op, they have a cafe, they have an elders community where like 70 plus elders live and are fed every day by the farm that's 40 plus acres. It's run by 5 people. And they do a year-round CSA for the elders, and then they do a summer CSA for over like 30 families. And it's like beyond organic, right? It's literally, it's a practice that has existed before that word even came to being. Actually, the person who coined the term organic was influenced by Rudolf Steiner's writing, and he came up with the word organic. So biodynamics like pre-organic. But in terms of the preparations, it's a very specific set of preparations that are made with herbs that then get buried in the soil. So you bury different herbs in different parts of your farm that have different sun exposures, different water exposures, different drainages, and then that helps basically cultivate. It's like a compost starter, which is super interesting because when he was doing this like 100 years ago, 150 years ago, nobody got it. Like people were like, what are you doing? Like what? We're burying chamomile in the intestines of a stag, like what in the soil? What? But like if you do the math now, like if you actually look under a microscope at these preparations, you can see that they were farming micronutrients, they were farming mycelial networks, they were farming different, think of it as like kombucha, right? Like if you make your kombucha with a bad starter, you're going to attract nasty things into your booch and you're going to get a gross end product, right? You have to create the ideal system to create the ideal product, to invite the right I don't even want to say energies, to invite the right microorganisms into the biome you're creating, right? You want to create the right biome for the right microorganisms. You don't want to create a super caustic, messed up biome, and then that creates like a super caustic end result, which is kind of like what we're doing to the planet. So like we're moving back in terms of like actually resetting that process is like you can create nutritionally dense soil food, basically just using herbs and farming your microbiome and building it out. So that's what biodynamics do. And it's really funny too, and it's the last thing I'll mention about biodynamics is Rudolf Steiner, basically when he was asked like, why do this? He was like, you need to harvest and propagate the connectivity of your soil. He didn't have a term for it at the time. Like there wasn't like a scientific way of explaining it. But now looking back as like a person who's like informed in mycology and like interested in biodynamics, like he's basically farming mycelium. Like that's my idea, is like they're actually farming different like fungal populations and microbial populations to create like a more healthy and biodiverse like structure. So that's biodynamics. If you're interested in that, check out the Pfeiffer Center. They'll be open all weekend. They're so rarely open to the public that I'm like, if you can go. And And then outside of that, people have been observed to use mushrooms for oil spills. So this is using oyster mushrooms to remediate an oil spill. The process even being like straw that's inoculated with oyster mycelium, absorbing oil from the water, and still being able to fruit. And still being able to survive. So this is it just being dunked in oil and absorbing oil out and processing it. This is oil being straight added into the inoculated straw medium and oyster mushrooms still growing out of it. And it's a slow process, but it's better than nothing, right? It's better than just catching all the oil and like dumping it somewhere else. And here this is a mycobloom floating. So this is like having all that myceliated straw that we've been looking at stuffed into like a breathable bag, like a buoy, and still fruiting. So mushrooms are able to digest a lot of the things that like we cannot. I would not recommend eating these mushrooms afterwards, but this is something that is like being studied, and people are genetically selecting mushrooms that vigorously grow in these conditions so that we can have more solutions when these problems happen. Mushrooms for radiation remediation. This is the famous black mushroom at Chernobyl. This is, so they're radiotrophic fungi, and they are actually able to use radiation as a source of energy and to stimulate their growth. And so they've actually been found in Chernobyl, and they've also been found in Earth orbit spacecrafts. And this has actually become something that people are really interested in looking at, is like, how do you protect like our very fragile like spacefaring like technologies from solar radiation like out in the world? Well, like people are thinking about using mushrooms to do that. So this is that same black mole or black mushroom, but this isn't it in its mycelial phase, right? This is not it in its fruiting body phase. They're just keeping it in its mycelial phase, and they propagated it in this like agar, and they're actually seeing that like this plate is getting exposed to radiation, and instead of like degrading, the side that's inoculated is like growing and like creating a layer between whatever's underneath it of like radiotrophic mushrooms, right? So this is something people are investigating to this day. I'm trying to figure out like how can you use these mushrooms for like our space explorations. Also, in terms of like mushrooms for the future and like remediation, using mushrooms for packaging, right? Replacing styrofoam, which is like a super difficult material to put in the waste stream to begin with, but then what do you do with it once it's in the waste stream? It's one of the worst water pollutants. It's like in everything. How do we solve this? Okay, we need to make a biodegradable option that like you can take this packaging and throw it out in your garden, then you'll get mushrooms from it. Like that's the kind of solutions we need, instead of like, oh, you take this packaging and you throw it in the trash and then it ends up in some river in Ohio for 10,000 years, right? So we got mushrooms as replacing styrofoam. There's a lot of really cool videos about that. We don't have time, unfortunately. So if you guys look at the slideshow, you can check it out. The company that's working on that, this is from CNN. And then there's another company in Utrecht, I don't know. I think they're Dutch. I think it's a Dutch company, but they are in the Netherlands. They are they're trying to take mushrooms that eat plastic and create food from it. I don't know if I think that's necessarily like the safest, best idea, but I sort of understand it's like the worst post-apocalyptic narrative possible. It's like, okay, we got to eat plastic. Like, get the mushrooms that can digest the plastic. So you can learn more about them. On this link, you can just click the link and it'll take you to the video of this this strange object that we're looking at. But there are people who are interested in harnessing this capacity for like future food sustainability. And then also, this is like a longer video, not just talking about like how everything that we've mentioned so far, but also like mushrooms for textiles, mushrooms for heating, and all the myriad applications. You can use mushrooms to dye fibers. This is something that's both ancient and potentially has like an application for the future, right? We don't want to keep using these caustic dyes. They take a lot of petroleum to produce. Like, what if you can just grow a bunch of mushrooms and dye people's clothes that way? And there's also even like an interest in just making clothes from mushrooms and like using, this is a sort of like a SCOBY. So if you think of your SCOBY, it's the symbiotic community of yeast and bacteria, right? You can actually dry the SCOBY and use it as like fabric. So people are like looking into that and looking at all the ways that you can use mushrooms. And with that, it's 12:53. I was supposed to stop 4 minutes ago, so I'm just going to go ahead and pause here, and we can answer questions in a moment. But basically, to just summarize that, like, we're just on the very edge of understanding like all the applications for mushrooms, and like I encourage all of you to not only like investigate for yourself, but talk to people about it, because I think there's a lot of stigma around mushrooms that is like, oh, they're just like for psychedelics or like whatever, like they're poisonous, or that, you know, they don't have this value. They're just sort of seen as like this inert like being in the world, or people think there's plants or whatever. And like to try and just like initiate these conversations to make it like more acceptable and like in our everyday, but then also to start seeing them like as living beings, right? So like if you're in the grocery store and you see some oyster mushrooms, those mushrooms are still alive. You could go home and start a whole oyster mushroom farm from that mushroom, and like to start seeing that quality of like total regeneration, like completely able to like self-sustain, like always hardy. Like these are some like qualities that I think like we should like keep with us as we like look into sustainability for the future. And then I'll also mention, if any of this interested you today, I do a like 2.5/3 hour long intro to herbalism like once a month. The next one's happening on Saturday. So if you have any questions or you're like curious about it, everything's on earthardcenter.com. You can DM me, whatever. But we go in basically to like the traditions of ethnobotany around the world, the history of like Western ethnobotany, and then how that basically turned into like Western medicine, and then going from there into like practical applications of herbs and plants and mushrooms for your day-to-day. And that registration is still open. And then the last thing I'll say is that we are in our 5th year of fundraising for land. We are finally on the cusp, it seems like, of making some progress. We've been picked up by a group called the Cooperative Development Initiative, which is like a third-party nonprofit that helps with developing land-based farm co-ops. So if you're interested either in like getting involved in any way, or you want to help spread the word, or you want to like do a project together, we're super open, super excited, and you can just reach out to me there. Everything's on earthardcenter.com. You can write me an email or DM me, and that's pretty much all I have. That ends our